We now come to Amendment 24. I remind noble lords that anyone wishing to speak after the Minister should email the clerk during the debate. Clause 2, Amendment 24, Lord Hunt of King's Heath.
My Lords, the world is increasingly aware of China's forced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience. This horrific crime of forcibly removing the organs from living victims, the process leading to inevitable murder, has recently been found by the China Tribunal to be happening extensively. The organ recipient may have had their lives saved, but at the expense of another innocent life. And it's now a multi-million-pound commercial business in China, with wealthy Chinese officials, Chinese nationalists, and organ tourists receiving treatment in high-end recovery centres. Evidence of forced organ harvesting has grown, and whistleblowers have emerged. Millions of Chinese citizens are currently detained in labour camps. UN experts estimate that at least 1 million Uyghurs are being held in camps in the region of Xinjiang. Elsewhere throughout China, other ethnic and religious minorities are also being held in labour camps, such as Tibetan Buddhist Falun Gong practitioners and Christians. My Lords, companies are complicit in this from the West. Adidas, Nike, Zara, and Amazon are among the Western brands who, according to a coalition of civil society groups, are currently benefiting from forced labour of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. In July this year, a 13-ton shipment of hair products from Xinjiang worth more than $800,000 was seized by US Customs and Border Protection. This shipment including wigs made from human hair. This is hugely concerning considering many reports and personal testimonies of female Uyghur Muslims having had their heads forcibly shaved in the camps. Last year, the China Tribunal, chaired by Sir Geoffrey Nice QC, at the International Criminal, my Lords, concluded that forced organ harvesting has been committed for years throughout China on a significant scale, and that Falun Gong practitioners have been one and probably the main source of organ supply. And then in regard to the Uyghurs, the tribunal had evidence of medical testing on a scale that could allow them, amongst other uses, to become an organ bank. My Lords, I would just point out to Grand Committee the hugely vast body of evidence of forced organ harvesting in China. Such evidence includes detailed statistical analysis of transplantations and donations, numerous recorded undercover telephone conversations, including with well-known Chinese officials admitting to the practice of forced organ harvesting, legal and policy statements and practice of the CCP, advertisements and admissions of university and military personnel, incredibly short waiting times, and a large number of personal testimonies. The China Tribunal spent 12 months assessing all available evidence. Additionally, the Tribunal's international panel of highly respected individuals interviewed over 50 witnesses, experts and investigators, and formally invited representatives of the People's Republic of China to respond. My Lords, I don't believe it is any longer sufficient for the UK government to ignore this. Now, so far, although ministers have personally been sympathetic, the government has relied on the World Health Organization's view that China is implementing an ethical voluntary organ transplant system. My Lords, I'm afraid this simply isn't credible. And the fact is, it's based on self-assessment by China itself, as became clear during my noble friend Lord Collins' PQ on 25th of July 2020. And my Lords, the WHO has not carried out its own expert assessment of China's organ transplant system. And so, my Lords, I'm afraid that the WHO cannot be considered to be reliable in this area. And for me, the China Tribunal is persuasive on this point. Now, my Lords, this bill provides an opportunity to prevent British complicity in such crimes, and I think to send an important signal to other countries. Currently, the Human Tissue Act does not require appropriate consent for imported human tissue. In addition, imported human tissue for use in medical research doesn't require traceability. On ethical sourcing and use of human issues, tissues. The minister has written to me to state that whether sourced from within or outside of the UK, there is comprehensive domestic legislation to ensure the ethical and appropriate use of human tissues. Yes, my lords, but whilst this is all true for human tissue sourced from within the UK, this does not address the gap in legislation for imported human tissue. On the concern about the use of human tissues in the development of medicines, which, my lords, I do understand, the minister commented that the use of imported tissue in any medicines on the UK market is very limited. But, my lords, it might be limited. The fact is there is a gap in the legislation which could be exploited in the future. Now, my lords, I am very grateful to Lord Ahmed for his awareness of the passion which many of us feel about the allegations of forced organ harvesting in China and ensuring that the UK is not complicit in any way. And I hope, my lords, he will acknowledge that the amendment that I put forward, which has been signed by a number of very distinguished noble colleagues, my lords, this amendment is not prescriptive. And essentially what it does is to give ministers regulating making powers to deal with the issue if and when they decide to do so. My lords, up to now, we know many countries have pulled their punches when talking to China about these practices. And of course, my lords, as The Economist has pointed out, China's economic power has helped it to avoid censure regarding its abuse of the Uyghurs. Many companies in the West have appeared reluctant to use any leverage they may have to put pressure on China. And it's not helped by the reluctance of so many countries to accept that country. Now, my lords, the UK, of course, faces dilemmas too, and we've seen it already in relation to the issues over 5G, potentially Chinese investment in new nuclear energy. And my lords, I'm not naive. I understand some of the pressures that are on the government, but there has to be a time when we make a stand. And my lords, you know, I do think, and I was encouraged by the reported words of Dominic Raab to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee on 6th of October, when you refer to evidence of gross human rights violations against the Uyghur Muslim minority in Xinjiang province. And I pay tribute, my lords, to the government for being prepared to say that. I would just like them to go one step further, agree to what is a very modest amendment. It seeks to give ministers the powers to take action when they deem it right to do so. But my lords, in accepting it, it would be a very, very important signal about this country's attitude to gross human rights violations. And my lords, I have great pleasure in moving my amendment. Thank you.
Amendment proposed, page 2, line 23, at the end, insert the new words as printed on the Marshall list. I call the next speaker, Baroness Finlay of Llandaff. Baroness Finlay?
My lords, it's a great privilege to follow the powerful speech of the noble Lord Hunt of King's Heath. Whilst the Human Tissue Act of 2004 is thorough and comprehensive with regards to human tissue sourced from within the UK, this does not hold true for imported human tissue. Human tissue can be imported into the UK without any consent or traceability. Notably, if it is for use in medicines, traceability is required through the Human Tissue Quality and Safety for Human Application Regulations 2007. But for use in medical research, neither consent nor traceability is required. They are merely considered good practice. This means human tissue sourced from China, where people are imprisoned, tortured, and organs are extracted and sold for profit. The process having killed the donor, that their tissue can legally enter the UK and be used in medical research. I too have met with Sir Geoffrey Nice and seen the extensive evidence to the China Tribunal. Liu Yumei, an elderly Falun Gong practitioner, was originally arrested on December the 31st, 2000 in Beijing. Police officers threatened her that if she didn't give her name and address, they would take away her organs and her family wouldn't find her corpse. She was severely tortured during her detention, shackled to the bed by her neck, sexually abused, electrocuted, force-fed urine mixed with rice, and forcibly blood tested by a prison doctor. Many other tribunal witnesses underwent torture, blood sampling, and organ scans in detainment. Omer Bakar, a Uyghur witness, described forced blood and urine samples and full body examinations in 2017 in custody. Chillingly, Enver Toti, a former surgeon, recounted removing the organs from a prisoner whilst they were still alive. The China Tribunal concluded that forced organ harvesting has been committed for years throughout China on a significant scale, and that Falun Gong practitioners have been one and probably the main source of organ supply. And that, I quote, in regard to the Uyghurs, the tribunal has evidence of medical testing on a scale that could allow them, amongst other users, to become an organ bank. My lords, the UK cannot allow itself to be complicit. Our amendment simply authorises the power to implement regulation where needed on this issue. The Human Tissue Authority's Code of Practice does not require evidence of consent as mandatory. In this country, we have excellent transplant practices. They are subject to high standards of ethical behaviour and scrutiny. The Montgomery judgment of 2015 has made UK consent processes rigorous and detailed, requiring as a benchmark what a reasonable patient would expect to know. I declare I chair the UK Tribunal for Life Board of NHSBT. But despite all our efforts here, we still have a problem with lower donation rates in the ethnically diverse population. This is the group that's strongly represented on the transplant waiting list because diabetic renal failure is a relatively frequent reason for needing renal transplant. This amendment would send a very strong message across the UK that we do not tolerate unethical practice anywhere and could improve confidence in our own transplant systems. Increased confidence should lead to increased organ donation by families. Would research be impeded by giving the government the powers in this amendment? My lords, absolutely not. Research would not be impeded in any way. Current cell lines in research are long-standing. If new cell lines are sought, they'll be developed from germ cells consented to in this country. We have no need to import these from anywhere that consent is not absolutely unequivocal. An NHS Freedom of Information request revealed that in the last 10 years, 29 patients are known to have travelled to China for transplant surgery. Prior Freedom of Information requests confirmed that between 1995 and 2012, 22 people from the UK went to China to receive kidneys. 5 received kidneys from deceased donors and 17 received kidneys from living donors. No further information about the Chinese donors was given. My lords, are we happy with this when we know nothing about the consent processes? Were these truly voluntary donations? We don't know whether the living donors are adequately cared for, nor the details around the death of deceased donors. We need research into first-hand experiences of transplants outside the UK. My lords, other countries, including Spain, Italy, Taiwan, Israel, Norway, and Belgium, have already taken legislative action to stop unethical organ tourism to countries like China. Whilst I realise combating unethical organ tourism is not possible within the scope of this bill, preventing human tissue from victims of forced organ harvesting from entering the UK can be. The symbolism of this amendment should not be underestimated. It simply gives powers to the government, and it sends a strong message to all those patients awaiting transplant here that our ethical standards are of the highest calibre and that the minority groups in this country have nothing to fear. When tragedy strikes, they can give the gift of life by donating organs from their deceased relative and can even ask for priority if they themselves are awaiting transplantation. To justify resisting this amendment, the Noble Lord the Minister must spell out the unintended consequence of this, if there are any. To say this is not the bill, not the time, and so on. will just not be good enough, my lords. Thank you.
I call the next speaker, Baroness Jolly. Baroness Jolly? Not available at the moment. She's just coming, is she?
It can take some time.
Signed by noble friend Baroness Northover, allows the Secretary of State to make regulations about human tissue. And I repeat Lord Hunt of King's Heath explanation of his amendment. This was in our papers on the amendment. This amendment adds the origin and treatment of human tissue, including organs, to the list of matters about which regulations may be made by the appropriate authority in the context of that informed, valid, uncoerced, and demonstrably documented consent may not have been given for the harvesting of such human tissue and organs. My lords, I find it hard to imagine that any state has power over its citizens that few other states share. But I find it even harder to imagine how desperate and selfish people must be to buy them, knowing that their donors' lives will certainly be blighted or even lost to feed the Western market, the dark side of health consumerism. Currently, human tissue organs can be imported into the UK from countries such as China without traceability, documentation, or consent. And there is widespread concern that forced organ harvesting is taking place. It's appalling that Falun Gong Christians are targeted as donors. Although I hate to use that word donor, it suggests that the organ is freely and willingly given, where the evidence to the contrary is absolutely total. This amendment would urge the government to introduce legislation to ensure that the UK is not complicit in this. So I support the laws by my noble friend Baroness Northover, by Lord Hunt of King's Heath, Baroness Finlay of Llandaff, and also Lord Ribeiro, who put his name to this amendment. If the government is not supportive of this amendment, would the Minister confirm that she would be prepared to look at bringing a government amendment back to report stage to stop this abhorrent practice?
I call the next speaker, Lord Ribeiro.
My Lords, I'm delighted to add my name to the amendment so ably introduced by Lord Hunt and Baroness Finlay. The Human Tissues Authority Code of Practice refers to the EU Tissues and Cells Directive, requiring importers of donated material to have a detailed description of the criteria used for donor identification and evaluation, b, information provided to the donor or donor family, and c, how consent was obtained and whether the donation was voluntary, unpaid, or not. During my career as a surgeon and a urologist, I supported transplant teams to harvest organs from patients of mine who had requested their organs to be used in the event of their death. In every case, informed consent was obtained and relatives were in agreement and consented to the procedure. One cannot be confident that such arrangements pertain in relation to donor parts used in transplantation in China and elsewhere, particularly where the donors are likely to be prisoners. Advice I have received from the Royal College of Surgeons notes that sadly, the issue of UK patients travelling overseas for transplant surgery is not confined to China and is known to also occur in Pakistan and in India. A considerable number of UK patients have undergone kidney transplantation for living donors in this way. Sir Geoffrey Nice, in his report, which has been mentioned earlier by Baroness Finlay, met with the Royal College of Surgeons to discuss the alarming allegations relating to China. The Royal College of Surgeons found the allegations very alarming and the evidence concerning. We know, my lords, that in China, patients can receive organs within a matter of weeks. Heart transplant surgery can be booked in advance, and the percentage of emergency liver transplants compared to non-emergency, according to data collected from the China Liver Transplant Registration, is far higher than one would expect. Matthew Hill, a BBC journalist, was offered the liver from a Chinese hospital for $100,000 at very short notice during his investigation, something patients in the UK would struggle to achieve with a waiting time of several months. According to experts, an estimated 60,000 to 90,000 organ transplants are happening in China per year. Yet China's voluntary donation system was only established in 2013. And data from quite recently, June 2020, shows 2,127,955 people have registered as organ donors in China. That is a significant increase on the figure in 2014, which was 22,660. My lords, is it a coincidence that since the UK signed the Council of Europe Convention on Organ Trafficking in 2015, that in the same year, the Chinese government introduced legislation that rendered illegal the use of executed prisoners as organ donors? Contacts within the Transplant Society in the UK believe that this legislation was introduced in good faith, and that any such practices which continue are illegal and without official sanction. I hope, my lords, that that is the case. But the perception is that these practices have not ceased completely. It is a view of some UK transplant surgeons who visited China, as I have done, for transplant-related meetings, that large, prestigious hospitals practice within the law. But illegal practices do occur, and we should use this amendment to send a clear message to the Chinese government that they must make greater efforts to stamp out the illegal practices which tarnishes the reputation of that country. We have a moral and ethical obligation to investigate UK patients who receive transplants in China as identified by Baroness Finlay, and to be clear that we can identify the source of the transplant organs. That is doubly important because if complications occur, it will be the NHS which has to pick up the pieces. Finally, it would appear that although the UK has signed the Council of Europe Convention on Organ Trafficking, the UK has yet to ratify it. Will my noble friend the Minister undertake to explain why this has not been done?
I call the next speaker, Lord Alton of Liverpool.
My Lords, it's a great pleasure to be able to follow the noble Lord Ribeiro and to be able to support the noble Lord Hunt of King's Heath, my noble friend Lady Finlay, and other noble lords who have either spoken to or been one of the movers of Amendment 12. In doing so, I return to an issue that I raised at second reading and declare interest as set out in the register. On August the 2nd, 2018, the Times newspaper published a letter signed by me and Professor Joe Martin, President of the Royal College of Pathologists, and signed by 55 others, including Dr. Adnan Sharif, a consultant nephrologist in Birmingham, who is the Secretary of Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting. We began the letter by recalling the Liverpool Alderhay Children's Hospital scandal, which had involved the retention of human organs and tissue without consent, and which had led to the 2004 Human Tissue Act. With my own antecedents as a Liverpool Member of Parliament and as a one-time grateful parent, deeply appreciative of the skills of Alderhay doctors, I was appalled that such an ill-judged breach of ethics had inflicted such damage on a wonderful hospital. 14 years later, and notwithstanding that scandal and that important Act of Parliament, the 2004 Act, I was incredulous that in 2018, an exhibition entitled Real Bodies of Chinese Corpses and Body Parts, preserved with silicone in a process called plastination, was being staged for commercial gain at the National Exhibition Centre in Birmingham, denigrating, my lords, ethics, science and human rights, and far worse than even the scandal of Alder Hey. In our letter, Professor Martin and I said, I quote, "We believe that the legislation requires reform," and we pointed to what we described as a loophole being relied upon by a number of exhibitions that obtain bodies from countries with poor human rights records. In 2010, the Lancet had called for reform to plug that loophole. And between then and 2018, there had been at least 3 such exhibitions, all promoted under the banner of enhancing understanding of medicine, the anatomy and science. But dress this up as you may, this was a commercial exhibition, staged for financial gain. And in 2018, we pointed out that the US organisers, Imagination Exhibitions, have been unable to provide any evidence of consent for the use of these cadavers. The organisers merely said that the cadavers were unclaimed bodies obtained from Dalian-Hoff and Biotech, China. Imagine Exhibition's CEO, Tom Zahler, admitted in an interview that the bodies were, quotes, absolutely from China, but added that there was no documentation to prove their identities or to show they had agreed in life to donate their corpses in death. It is this lack of consent and documentation referred to by the Noble Lord, Lord Ribeiro, a few moments ago, which is deeply troubling and should have troubled the UK government, who, in answer to parliamentary questions from me at the time, said that they would not intervene. For me, it's deeply troubling that the UK has allowed the bodies of unknown Chinese citizens who may have been victims of torture, human rights violations, persecution or organ theft to be turned into a travelling circus. It is disrespectful and disgraceful in equal measure. And how can the government say that we have sufficient legislative measures in place? The 2004 Act governs licences connected to the display and use of human corpses and remains. Prior consent for bodies to be used for research, display or education is one of the founding principles of the 2004 Human Tissue Act. However, my lords, current regulations mean that there's a huge disparity between regulations for bodies coming from within the United Kingdom and for those coming from outside the United Kingdom. This makes absolutely no sense, and it's dilatory on the part of government to decline to rectify this. It's an issue which the noble Baroness Lady Thornton, the noble Lord Hunt, my noble friend Lady Finlay and I raised at a meeting with Baroness Manzour when she was a minister. Significantly, when considering the requirement contained in this amendment involving validation and consent, a similar exhibit entitled Bodies, the Exhibition by Premier, who also sourced plastinated bodies from Dalian-Hoff and Biotech, reached a settlement with the New York State Attorney General in 2008 to display a disclaimer. It stated this: "This exhibit displays human remains of Chinese citizens of residence which were originally received by the Chinese Bureau of Police. The Chinese Bureau of Police may receive bodies from Chinese prisons. Premier cannot independently verify that the human remains you are viewing are not those of persons who were incarcerated in Chinese prisons." The Birmingham exhibition was little different to the exhibition in New York, but it carried no such disclaimer. I might add, my lords, that I'm not arguing for disclaimers, but for prohibition, as happens in other jurisdictions such as Israel and France, where commercial exhibitions of body parts imported without valid consent are forbidden, and they should be outlawed here too. Article 611, alinéa 2 of the French Civil Code requires the remains of deceased persons to be treated with respect, dignity and decency, and clearly an exhibition of cadavers aimed at making money doesn't respect or meet that requirement. By contrast, human tissue from abroad has no consent or traceability requirements to enter the UK, nor to be put on display for commercial gain. Neither is consent or traceability required for imported human tissue to be used in medical research. The UK has arguably some of the most ethical and comprehensive consent requirements for human tissue in the world, yet imported human tissue slips through the net. Noble Lords will see that this amendment would take a welcome step in closing that net by at least requiring the users of organs and tissues being appropriated for the development of medicines and treatments to identify their origins. It will enable the relevant authority, through regulation, to insist on a rebuttable presumption requiring the users of such organs or tissue to demonstrate that informed, valid, uncoerced and demonstrably documented consent had been given for the harvesting of such human tissues and organs. And, my lords, how likely is it, in the case of the Chinese Communist Party, that such valid documentation could be produced? In 2018, I asked that question of ministers and was appalled by the complacency of the replies. Like a game of pass the parcel, the Foreign Office minister said that no other government department had asked the Foreign Office, quotes, to make formal representations to the Chinese authorities, and that they had, quotes, no evidence that the exhibition contained the cadavers of Chinese political or religious prisoners. But did they even bother to look? And why were the FCO waiting for other departments to raise it with them? I asked a government law officer who complacently told me it wasn't his concern and that it was a matter for the coroner. Meanwhile, in a series of other questions, I'd specifically raised the plight of Falun Gong practitioners, 1 million incarcerated Uyghurs, Tibetan Buddhists, house church Christians, underground Catholics, and a whole host of cases involving abductions, disappearances, torture, ethnic cleansing, execution, and potential genocide. In parenthesis, I might say, my lords, that only today I received a reply to a parliamentary question from the FCDO about Zhang Shan, a citizen journalist abducted by the authorities in China 5 months ago after she reported on COVID-19. She is reported to now be on a hunger strike. The government says it has made no representations on her behalf. My lords, the bodies I've referred to and put on public parade in Birmingham had their origins in China, where we are all too well aware of the plight of dissenters and believers and the imprisonment, arrest and disappearance of lawyers who've challenged everything from the one-child policy to abuse of power and women like the citizen journalist Zhang Shan. The connection with Dalian is particularly troubling because the Dalian district of northwest China, and specifically Dalian's PSB, that is the Public Security Bureau, which is the local police and prison service, is known for human rights violations, known for organ transplant activity and the persecution of Falun Gong. Please note also that during the Real Bodies exhibition, the NEC stated that all bodies on display were, quote, unclaimed bodies, which had been donated legally. But how could they possibly verify that? The connection with the PSB and unclaimed bodies used in the exhibition had long been suspected. And in 2012, the chairman of Dalian Hoffian Biotechnology Co., someone called Sui Honjin, admitted that, I quote, dozens of corpses came from public security. They were procured by the Public Security Bureau. In China, the term unclaimed bodies can be interpreted in multiple ways. Firstly, it can be a term for people who have died in hospitals with no next of kin, but equally it can be a term for prisoners of conscience who have, while suffering detention and imprisonment, refused to provide their real identities through fear of repercussions for their family and friends. Multiple investigations from different sources have concluded that large-scale, unexplained organ transplant activity has taken place and continues to do so. In these investigations, the PSB has been documented as being a key element between the prison and labour camps and hospitals performing organ transplants. Then, my lords, in June 29, the China Tribunal, referred to by the Noble Lord, Lord Hunt and others, chaired by the redoubtable lawyer Sir Geoffrey Nice QC, a prosecutor at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, said in a unanimous determination by that tribunal, and which is set out in detail in his Gresham lecture, which can be viewed and watched online, that it was, I quote, certain that Falun Gong was a source, probably the principal source, of organs for forced organ harvesting. In an interview with the Daily Telegraph, Sir Geoffrey said that the UK government ignored continued organ harvesting in China to avoid acknowledging what he called an inconvenient truth. Along with others, I've urged the government to be more committed to shining a light on this horrific practice and to raise the matter directly with the World Health Organization, an issue which the Noble Lord, Lord Collins, and I have both asked the Noble Lord, Lord Ahmed about. On September the 23rd, the Noble Lord, Lord Ahmed confirmed that a letter to the WHO had now been sent. I welcome that, but when I asked in an oral question for them to publish the contents of that letter, the government refused to do so. So much, my lords, for open government. I've submitted a Freedom of Information request to the FCDO. Surely, as a principle of transparency and openness, this correspondence should be in the public domain. This is a global issue with national repercussions. It's a global trade involving both Chinese nationals and foreign tourists using organs linked to abuse of prisoners, ethnic and religious minorities, and prisoners of conscience, and with some reports suggesting that victims are killed on demand for their origins. And underlining the international activities of these mafias, I was recently given a report about how poverty-stricken Pakistanis have been lured into transplant tourism, selling their organs to make some survival money. In September, the Pakistani Federal Investigation Agency arrested 7 suspects involved in an international racket transporting Pakistanis to China for illegal surgery. The country's Human Organ Transplant Authority says it's largely impotent, with one doctor describing how agents enlisted the poor with offers of riches in return for their liver or kidneys as a way of escaping the slavery of bonded labour. At least 20 companies, and maybe as many as 28, supply China, in some cases for over 20 years, with materials, drugs and devices supporting the development of transplantation business, while being aware of the facts and evidence related to illegal organ harvesting. It's a lucrative business with the revenue reaching billions of dollars. Sir Geoffrey's Tribunal says that such companies, along with governments who interact in any substantial way with the PRC, including doctors and medical institutions, industry and businesses, should now recognise, their words, that they are interacting with a criminal state. The WHO should be leading the campaign to ensure that every country is challenged to put national legislation into place to ensure that both international and national action is taken to end this criminal trade. The UK, as a principal donor to the WHO, should be using that leverage, but it should also be sanctioning individuals who are known to be involved in the trade and passing legislation like this amendment to show it isn't telling others to do what it isn't willing to do itself. It should also show more courage in dealing with the CCP, and instead of suggesting it has no evidence, listen instead to witnesses like the courageous former surgeon in China, Dr. Envertoti, referred to by my noble friend Lady Finlay, and whom I have met and taken a statement from, and who told me he was ordered, his words, to cut deep and work fast on a victim who was still alive. Dr. Toti has spoken here in Parliament. On October the 16th, 2018, at one such meeting to highlight forced organ harvesting, I argued for legislation to ensure that, whether for commercial gain, through staging macabre, grotesque exhibitions of body parts from unknown victims, to using their mortal remains to supplement the profits of giant pharmaceuticals, or to provide organs for people involved in organ tourism, the Parliament needed to force the hand of government. When we held that meeting, I encouraged a long-standing colleague and friend from Merseyside, Mary Rimmer, the Member of Parliament for St Helens North, to attend. She has valiantly and diligently pursued this issue in the House of Commons during debates on this bill. Through the amendment of the noble Lord Hunt, we now have the opportunity to give a name and an identity to those who, in both death and life, have been so outrageously violated, and to put far more stringent provisions into law. To end, my lords, in 1832, Parliament passed the Anatomy Act after 2 Scots were convicted of murders, and along with other body snatchers and grave robbers, the so-called resurrection men, of supplying bodies for dissection for use by Robert Knox in his anatomy lectures. In 2020, and with new international challenges, similar legislative action is surely necessary, and I therefore have great pleasure in supporting the amendment of the noble Lord Hunt.
The Lord Mackay of Clashfern, who is next on the list, has withdrawn, so I call Lord Patel.
My lords, it's always very difficult to follow the noble Lord Alton of Liverpool, because his speeches are always so powerful, so convincing, and well researched. So I do this with some hesitation, but I absolutely agree with him, and I find it abhorrent that plastinated bodies of human beings are used for commercial purposes in exhibition. To me, it is not science, and I don't think it's art either, but it's certainly not science, and they should be banned, and I was surprised when that exhibition took place. I also am aware of the tissues taken and organs taken from children at the Alderhay Hospital. I was involved subsequently with the inquiry that took place and heard the harrowing stories of parents whose children's organs were taken without their consent and stored. thousands of them. I heard the powerful speeches made by all of the noble lords so far, and I'm very touched, and I support them all. I think Lord Hunt has raised an important issue, and I agree with him that the amendment that he asked is a modest amendment for the government to take powers to look and amend the Tissue Act if required. I have chaired for 4 years the Medical Research Council's Ethics Committee in the past, and I have chaired for over 4 years the Stem Cell Bank of the United Kingdom. And I'm also familiar with the Research Ethics Committee as at one time chairman of National Patient Safety Agency, which the noble Lord Hunt of King's Heath chaired before me, and introduced the nationwide regime for examining of consent through the Ethics Committee, which is now a statutory committee. And comments have been made, and it is correct, that the issue of consent for tissues, organs in United Kingdom is strict. The monitoring of the use of tissues for any purposes is strict. Noble Lord Hunt has alluded to the fact that the law in terms of importation of tissues is lax. And I think if that is the case, that certainly needs examining. I looked at the law as it is, and what the various websites of HTS says about importation of tissues, particularly what it says about the consent. Now I take the point, and I agree with it, but the point that noble Lord Alton of Liverpool has made, that how could you be certain about the validity of that consent? And I think that's an important point. So I think the amendment that the noble Lord has proposed is seriously worth considering by the government. The only thing I would say in terms of research, and I'm now going to tell a story about HeLa cells, which I do so not to immortalize HeLa cells, which they're immortal cell lines, but to immortalize the person from whom a tissue sample was taken, Henrietta Lack, hence they're called HeLa cells, on 8th of February, 1951. A Black American mother of 5 who had developed extremely aggressive cervical cancer, who attended a hospital, Johns Hopkins, in Baltimore, and a tissue for diagnostic purposes was taken from her cancer. But that tissue was then passed on to a laboratory that was trying to culture cell lines. And ever since then, HeLa cells are used all over the world and have been used for developing treatments of all kinds of therapies. For instance, they were used by Salk to develop the Salk vaccine for polio. They were used for cancer cells to develop treatments for breast cancers. They were used as xenografts to develop, again, cancer treatments. They're used for studying aging processes because they do not show normally as cells age in us. They eventually become senescent and produce and inflammatory, producing some of the chronic diseases that humans suffer from. But the cells, HeLa cells, don't seem to do that. And therefore telomerase, which controls the size of telomere, which is part of the aging process. So these cells have been used for all kinds of things. So it is my concern also about tissue use and commercialization is there are lots of commercial companies who advertise, and you can see them on the net if you wish, that will supply tissues to industry for their testing of drugs. And I do not know how much of a consent is required or how much of a consent from HTA is required to import these tissues or where they come from. The only one thing I say when the government looks at this is to distinguish between tissues, organs, and cell lines, and why they are treated differently and why the purpose of treating them differently might be. I do not say that they do not require regulation. What I say is we need to clearly understand why cell lines are different than tissues and organ when it comes to importation. Thank you, my lord. I support this amendment. Thank you, my lord.
Baroness Stroud, who is next on the list, has withdrawn. So I call Lord Sheikh.
My lords, I would like to fully support Amendment 24. My lords, the issue of organ harvesting was raised in the other place and also in the second reading of the bill in your lordship's house by myself and other noble peers. My lord, the ability to use human tissues in medicines and transplant saves many lives and is a great achievement of modern science. But we need to make sure that the way human tissue, which is obtained and is used, is completely ethical. At the moment, we do not have legislation that properly stops organs that have been obtained forcibly or without proper consent from entering the UK. My lords, this is completely unacceptable. You should be greatly concerned about the treatment of Muslim Uyghurs and Falun Gong in China. The detention and persecution of these innocent people is a crime against humanity. Millions are suffering and tortured in inhumane conditions, and great many of them have been murdered. My lords, last year, the China Tribunal, chaired by Sir Geoffrey Nice QC, concluded that forced organ harvesting in China has been practiced for a substantial period of time, involving a very substantial number of victims. The tribunal also found that Muslim Uyghurs are being used as an organ bank. Furthermore, the British Medical Journal has found that 99% of studies undertaken to look into organ transplants in China did not report that the organs which were used were donated with consent. My lords, this is unacceptable and a disturbing violation of human rights, and also this is illegal. Furthermore, the economics of organ harvesting in China report found that large profits have been made from organ harvesting. My lords, I appreciate that although the companies, including British companies, may not be directly involved in organ harvesting, but I feel that they could possibly be part of a wider system. This wider system provides devices, drugs, materials, and know-how for transplantation. Sir Geoffrey Nice QC also stated that anyone who is interacting with the People's Republic of China is interacting with a criminal state. This means that if we do not have proper checks on human tissue entering the UK, we risk being complicit in this crime. My lords, organ harvesting is not limited to China. There are gangs and traffickers all over the world that exploit vulnerable people to obtain organs without any proper aftercare. My lords, this coercion is also illegal and must be stopped. Through this amendment, we can prevent this happening and close the gaps in our existing legislation. For instance, the 2004 Human Tissue Act has strict consent and documentation requirements for tissue in the UK, but it does not enforce the same standards for imported tissue. Instead, it only advises that same standards should be applied. Although the 2007 Human Tissue Regulation ensures that there is proper documentation and tracking from donor to recipient, it requests details on how consent is obtained and looks into whether the donation was voluntary or unpaid or not at all. This means there is no legislation against importing organs that have been obtained involuntarily and without consent. My lords, we must accept this amendment so we can make better regulations that uphold human rights and values. By including the ability to make provisions about the origin and treatment of human tissue used in developing and manufacturing medicines, this amendment means we can make regulations if there are any concerns as to whether consent has or has not been given. These regulations request that informed, uncoerced, and properly documented consent must be given for any tissue entering the United Kingdom. My lords, at present, we do not have appropriate safeguards against forced organ harvesting or human tissue. My lords, innocent people are being tortured and killed, whilst businesses and some governments have been making a profit. This amendment is an opportunity to make a proper stand against organ harvesting and have a statutory commitment. Through this amendment, we can ensure that all human tissue imports are ethical. My lords, during the second reading of this bill, my noble friend, Lord Patel, did state that the idea that any British companies are profiting from these trades is abhorrent. My lords, this is an abhorrent practice. We must put a stop to it and therefore pass this amendment. Finally, I'd like to say, my lords, I would like to emphasize, in fact, that it is our moral duty to do so. Thank you.
I call the next speaker, Baroness Northover.
I am very pleased to have added my name to Amendment 24. Lord Hunt of King's Heath is to be commended for his determination on this issue. Given his previous service as a health minister, as well as his career-long engagement at different levels of the NHS, no one can say that he does not have a very good grasp of all the implications of his amendments. As the noble Lord has made clear, this amendment gives the power to the government to take action in this area. It closes the gap between what is expected in terms of the origins and uses of human tissue in the UK and that which may be brought in from overseas. As we've heard, the human bodies exhibitions were able to slip through this gap. So it cannot be said that no problem can be envisaged. The noble Lord, Lord Alton, has laid out the potentially horrendous origins of those bodies. Like Lord Hunt, Lord Alton has been determined and assiduous in pursuing such cases, and he is remarkable in his ability never to pass by on the other side. And he made a powerful and passionate contribution here, as usual. Baroness Finlay, Lord Ribeiro, Lord Alton and others have laid out in appalling terms the concerns that exist about organ harvesting, particularly in China, but which is known elsewhere as well, as Lord Sheikh has just mentioned, particularly where poverty has often driven unethical use of organs. There have been recent reports from Egypt, and there were persistent reports from India, for example, with huge concern mounting about the scale of transplantation in China and the apparently generous and immediate supply of organs, something which is the polar opposite elsewhere. As Lord Ribeiro noted, the independent China Tribunal was set up. It was chaired by Sir Geoffrey Nice. His background is, of course, as a prosecutor in the Bosnian war crimes tribunals. He had no background or preconceptions as to what may have happened in China. The tribunal concluded that crimes against humanity had occurred beyond reasonable doubt. The tribunal found that the market of human organs and tissue is a state-sanctioned project where in many cases victims who are persecuted for their beliefs are subsequently tortured and their organs removed while still alive. That is absolutely appalling. Evidence included recorded undercover telephone calls, some of which were at the very highest levels in the Chinese government, including the Minister of Health and above, and which indicated the highest authority for this practice. A number of these calls indicated that human organs were available on demand. The significance of that is chilling. We know that China, as well as many others, has aspired to lead in the field of transplantation. We have also heard from Lord Hunt, Lord Alton, and others how lucrative this field is. Doctors from leading Chinese transplant hospitals admit in undercover phone calls that organs harvested from Falun Gong detainees are available. A Chinese government official who called himself the butcher compared live organ harvesting to slaughtering pigs. After scooping the organs out, I would sell them, he said. 4 methods of live organ harvesting were exposed during the tribunal, including killing prisoners by removing organs, lethal injection, and organ harvesting under the pretext of brain death. The tribunal concluded with certainty that acts of torture had been inflicted, particularly on the Uyghur population. Last year, the BMA Medical Ethics Committee Chair, John Chisholm, described forced organ harvesting as, and I quote, a gross and continuing violation of inalienable and fundamental human rights. We have heard very clearly from the noble Baroness Finlay, the noble Lord Ribeiro, and the noble Lord Patel, the thorough case laid out by these 3 leading members of the medical profession. It is very clear that the last thing the medical profession in the United Kingdom wishes for is for their reputation to be tarnished by this terrible practice. And most importantly too, they do not see risks, such as risks to research, if protections are put in place, as sought here. In fact, the noble lady, Lady Finlay, makes the case that the reassurance this change will provide could help those from ethnic minorities who are reluctant to agree to organ donation from relatives whom they may have lost, because they know this will not be abused. The noble lady, the minister, has a reputation for doing her homework. Can she confirm that she has read the China Tribunal's report? We hear from the noble the minister, Lord Ahmed, that he's now engaging with the WHO on this matter. We know how challenging that is, as the noble Lord Hunt has outlined in relation to the power and influence of China. Both Lord Alton and Lord Collins are right to be pushing the government on this matter. Here we have the means to take action which need not wait on that. It is simply permissive. It enables the government to take action. As other noble lords have said, it is a moral and ethical case. We have the opportunity to create regulations to help protect the UK from being complicit in such appalling crimes. I am sure that the House of Lords will support the noble Lord, Lord Hunt, on his amendment. I look forward to the noble lady's agreement to this amendment, or as my noble friend Baroness Jolly has said, to her agreeing to take forward the essence of this amendment for report stage.
I call the next speaker, Lord Collins of Highbury.
Thank you, my Lord. Can I begin by thanking all noble lords who put their name to this amendment, because it truly reflects the cross-party and across-the-house concern for this issue. And I'd also like to echo the comments by the noble lady, Baroness Northover, regarding my noble friend, Lord Hunt, who's been absolutely committed to continue to raise this important issue. And as noble Lord Patel said, this is a modest amendment, and it is designed to empower the government, to act, to create regulations to help protect the United Kingdom from being complicit in the abhorrent crimes evidenced by the China Tribunal chaired by Sir Geoffrey Nice QC. But as also my noble friend Lord Hunt said, it is also an opportunity for the government to send a clear signal, a clear message that we will not stand by, we will not tolerate such gross abuses of human rights. And can I also say to the noble lady, the Minister, and the noble Lord, the Minister, can I thank them for meeting me and other noble lords interested in this issue, and for arranging the FCDO Minister, the noble Lord Ahmed, to be present so that we could all hear exactly what cross departments are doing on this issue. My lords, in their final reports, the China Tribunal concluded that forced organ harvesting has been committed for years throughout China on a significant scale, with Falun Gong practitioners and the Uyghurs being the main victims. And as my noble friend Lord Hunt said, Sir Geoffrey Nice and the Tribunal spent 12 months assessing all the available evidence. Additionally, the Tribunal's international panel of highly respected individuals interviewed over 50 witnesses, experts and investigators, and formally invited the representatives of the People's Republic of China to respond. And of course, Sir Geoffrey himself has an incredible reputation as a former lead prosecutor of the Slobodan Milosevic at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. My lords, some of the other evidence I just want to draw attention to is also what The Guardian reported on, the study by the medical journal BMJ Open, which raised ethical issues of over 400 studies conducted in China using an estimated 85,477 organ transplants. 99% of the studies failed to report whether organ donors had given consent from transplantation. The paper concluded, and I quote, "The transplant community has failed to implement ethical standards of banning publication of research material from executed prisoners. As a result, a large body of unethical published research now exists, raising questions of complicity to the extent that the transplant community uses and benefits from the results of this research." The government of the People's Republic of China, as we've heard in this debate, denies all such claims, relying on the fact that the WHO cleared them of wrongdoing. In June of this year, I reminded the Minister, the Noble Lord Ahmed, that 12 months earlier he had shared my concern that the evidence on which the WHO cleared China was based on self-assessment by the Chinese authorities. And at that time, the Noble Lord Ahmed stated, the government's position remained that the practice of systematic state-sponsored organ harvesting would constitute a serious violation of human rights. He assured the House that the UK regularly raised these concerns with China. And of course, at the recent meeting that I have referred to with other noble lords with an interest in this amendment, the Noble Lord Ahmed confirmed that the UK had sent the full report of the China Tribunal to the WHO, asking them to respond to the evidence. My Lords, the fact remains the WHO does not have an independent expert compliance assessment mechanism. It merely has a reporting requirement. Personally, I hope that the UK and the government and the Noble Lord Ahmed, I've raised this, will continue to press the WHO for a clear response to the report and will argue for a proper independent assessment by the WHO to guarantee compliance in the future. But my Lords, today is not about whether the WHO acts or not. It is about this country saying quite clearly that it will not be complicit in these abhorrent acts. Nothing, absolutely nothing I have heard today from noble lords much better qualified than me suggests that by passing this amendment we would hinder medical research or progress. As the noble lady Baroness Finlay pointed out, the UK has arguably some of the most ethical and comprehensive consent requirements for human tissues in the world, yet imported human tissue slips through the net. This is an opportunity that I'm sure we won't forget and we won't miss. I hope the noble lady, the Baroness, the Minister will respond positively. And of course, as we've heard in this debate, there are other issues. It's been reported, and I raised this in the second reading. 2 UK companies supply organ preserving devices to mainland China, which could explain how they are being transported around China. My Lords, we are all agreed that we need to ensure ethics in the origin and treatment of human tissue and organs in the process of developing and manufacturing medicines. This amendment, as I said before, would give the government the means to ensure that human body tissue and organs that are being forcibly harvested are not allowed to enter the UK for medicines or medical testing. But as I say, this amendment is not just as important as that, is the message that we can send to the world, and in particular the People's Republic of China, that we will not stand by. This is an opportunity we should not miss, and I do hope the Minister will be able to respond to Noble Lord's amendment today positively.
I call on Baroness Penn to reply to the debate on this important amendment.
Let me begin by thanking noble lords for their time last week to speak to me and my noble friend about the issues raised in relation to Amendment 24. We've listened very carefully to the concerns raised both in meetings and during the second reading debate and again today. And first and foremost, I would like to reiterate the government's position that, if true, the practice of systematic state-sponsored organ harvesting would constitute a serious violation of human rights. And I know that my noble friend Lord Ahmed, Minister for South Asia and the Commonwealth, takes the concerns expressed by noble lords very seriously, and he continues to monitor the issue very closely. As noble lords may know, my noble friend Lord Ahmed wrote to the WHO encouraging them to give careful consideration to the findings of the 1st of March report by the International Coalition to End Transplant Abuse in China. And we hope to have a response to this shortly. And as my noble friend indicated, he is happy to meet with noble lords again to discuss this further. Noble lords have spoken powerfully on a number of issues that go beyond the scope of this bill, and I hope they will forgive me if I focus my remarks on the specifics of Amendment 24. As I said when we met last week, I think we are largely agreed with respect to the outcome we wish to achieve, and this is about getting the mechanism right. None of us want our UK medicines industry to be compromised by unethically sourced human tissues. But I do think it's important to be clear that the vast majority of tissue-based medicinal products in the UK do not use material sourced from a donor at all. They use patients' own tissues. And as we have outlined previously, there is only one licensed medicine on the UK market that does use donor tissue. And this material is procured within the EU. The product uses human adult stem cells extracted from fat tissues, and those cell donations are taken in Spain during the process of liposuction. The starting material is procured from authorised EU centres in accordance with the EU Tissues and Cells Directive. Noble lords will also know that there are schemes where UK sites may be licensed to manufacture tissue or cell-based products without marketing authorisation. But even amongst these, there is only one site which uses donor tissue, and that tissue is sourced within the UK. That is not to say that I don't have sympathy with this amendment, with what this amendment seeks to achieve. Noble lords have made clear that they would like to ensure the bill allows for changes to be made as necessary to the regulation of human medicines, which could tighten requirements around the use of tissues in development of medicines. And my lords, I'd like to reassure noble lords that the bill, as drafted, does already provide powers to allow us to make regulatory changes to tighten requirements, such as strengthening requirements on evidence of consent that would be provided as part of the marketing authorisation process. Nevertheless, I also understand the desire of noble lords to make this explicit and send a message on this issue. But I do have to say there are some important drafting deficiencies to the amendment as it stands. The amendment specifically refers to the origin and treatment of human tissues used in the process of developing medicines. My concern is that, as a term, developing medicines causes too much ambiguity. There is no single established point in the preclinical stages of research where the development of a new medicinal product begins. How far back into research studies does the development of medicine start? Does it, for instance, capture academic research on a substance, but where the research then finds the product to be of medicinal value? Equally, medicinal products are often developed with international partners, and the early medicines development is inevitably outside of UK jurisdiction. And so how would new consent requirements be applied in that context? These are important drafting questions. It is important to ensure that any enabling power is drafted with the appropriate level of precision. As noble lords know, the drafting has a material impact on the potential subject matter of any regulations made under that power. We would not want wording on the face of the bill to inadvertently create risk of unintended consequences when making regulations. For instance, if regulations were made to apply significant broad consent requirements when testing medicines, this may capture medicines tested on cell lines which date back over 50 years and for which seeking evidencing consent would be impossible. So, as the noble Lord Patel referred to, we would want to think very carefully about the scope of any regulation and the approach that we should take in this matter. We've heard many noble lords talk about the importance of supporting future availability of innovative new medicines in the UK throughout debates on this bill, and they are right. The same is true for ongoing supply of established medicines to the UK market. So whilst I am, as I have said, sympathetic to the noble Lord Hunt's amendment, I'm concerned that the current drafting would create a risk of unintended consequence when making regulations. My Lords, there's also an important point on consistency. Within the bill, legislation relating to human medicines is defined in Clause 7 to include comprehensive pieces of legislation such as the Human Medicines Regulations 2012 and the Medicines for Human Use Clinical Trial Regulations 2004. With that in mind, when it comes to human medicines, the powers in this bill are concerned with clinical trials. To add the concept of development would create confusion and inconsistency with drafting elsewhere in the bill, in particular Clause 1(2)(c). My Lords, I would like to thank all noble lords for the considerable thought and engagement which they have given to this issue, and I would really welcome further discussion between officials, myself and the noble lord, the minister, in coming weeks to discuss the issues that noble lords have raised and the drafting issues that I've mentioned today. The noble Lord Ribeiro asked a specific question around the Council of Europe and ratification of a treaty there, and I will ask the FCDO to write to him on that matter. I therefore hope that the noble Lord Hunt feels able to withdraw his amendment today, and I look forward to further discussions on this matter between committee and report.
My Lords, I've received a request to speak after the Minister from Baroness Northover, whom I now call.
Thank you very much. Could the noble lady tell me whether she has read the China declaration for this amendment, as I asked when I was speaking to this, and if she hasn't, will she agree to do so before report, especially to help inform her, as she may be coming forward with her own amendment, as I hope she's indicating?
Minister.
My apologies to the noble Lady Northover. I have read the findings of the report and I will agree to read the full report ahead of any further meetings that we have.
I call on Lord Hunt of King's Heath to conclude the debate on this amendment.
My Lords, this has been a very powerful debate. Each contribution has been measured and a product of expertise, human value and internationalism. I'm very grateful to Baroness Finlay, Baroness Jolly, Lord Ribeiro, Lord Alton, Lord Patel, Lord Sheikh, Baroness Northover and Lord Collins. I'm also grateful to the Minister, who I thought provided a very constructive response at the end. My Lords, when the noble Lord Alton talked about Alderhay, he probably didn't realise that this is where really my interest in this whole subject stemmed from, because I was the minister responsible for the Northwest at the time the scandal emerged. I appointed the chair of the inquiry and I met parents involved on a number of occasions. And I listened to the harrowing tales of parents who actually, some of them took part in 3 funerals of parts of their child's body. And my Lords, what happened was shocking. And I learned from that how crucial it is that when we deal with human tissues, human organs, the integrity of the process is absolutely vital. I was also very fortunate to be able to take through the organ donation presumed consent bill in your Lordship's house a couple of years ago, which is now law, and which hopefully changes the basis of organ consent and will lead to more organ donations in this country, something noble Baroness Lady Finlay referred to eloquently. And again, my Lords, when you move to presumed consent, you have to have absolute trust in the integrity of all the people involved. And just as it's important in this country, so it is globally, which is why I believe we must take action in relation to the activities of China and indeed other countries, as we've heard during this debate tonight. Now, my Lords, I listened very carefully to what the noble Baroness, the Minister, had to say. And she did make the point that in relation to human tissues, that the use of imported tissues is very limited. Nonetheless, my Lords, we have identified a gap in the legislation. And the noble Baroness made 2 points, really. She said, first of all, that the bill already provides for the kind of authority we wish to give to ministers. And then she went into detail in the drafting challenges that she thought our amendment faced. However, my lords, I think that the words she was used in a very constructive way. And I'm very, very grateful to her. And can I reassure her that I will be very willing, and my colleagues will be very willing, to work with her officials to see if we can come up with an amendment that meets our needs, but also does not lead to the kind of perverse incentives that she has referred to. My lords, I think this has been a wonderful debate. I think we've had a constructive response from the government. I'm convinced that we are going to make progress and that we will, at the end of the day, in this legislation, make a mark, important in this country, but also internationally, that we will do everything we can to stop this appalling process. Having said that, my lords, I beg leave to withdraw my amendment.
Is it your lordship's pleasure that this amendment be withdrawn? Amendment by leave withdrawn.